Thank you, Janine. Welcome, everyone. As Janine mentioned, today we're going to be providing an update on some of our science associated with monitoring, as well as Pinyon-juniper management and some other related items. But this is really an opportunity for a highlight, long-standing partnerships with resource management agencies. Much of the research that you'll see today has been funded by the Bureau of Land Management, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, USGS. But there's often a component of much more stakeholders and partners, including but not limited to state wildlife agencies. So we're going to kick this off with Robert Arkle from our USGS Forest and Rangeland Ecosystem Science Center. And today, Robert's going to be talking about a couple projects that have been ongoing for a couple of years, including linking monitoring to things like the sagebrush conservation design, and also some projects in both Oregon and Nevada focused on rangeland monitoring. And so, Robert, you can queue up your slides and talk to us about removing barriers and scaling monitoring to match capacity. I see your face. I see your slides.
And you hear my voice.
The floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Leaf. So as Leaf said, I'm going to talk about some monitoring considerations and then give an example of how we're helping resource managers reduce barriers to monitoring and information sharing. This collaboration between the USGS Fish and Wildlife and Oregon State University INR is funded by OWEB, Bill, USGS Fire Science Program, amongst a couple others. One of the most common requests that our USGS team here in Boise gets is folks asking for help designing and implementing a monitoring program. For most resource managers, designing studies is kind of out of their wheelhouse, so it can be overwhelming given all the other demands on their time. They usually have very limited resources to get their answers, and so there's a real trade-off. And there's a few key factors that we encourage folks to consider. First, we spend a lot of time nailing down, what are you going to do with the information that you generate? Is it for project reporting? Is it for a journal article? Or is it simply to inform adaptive management? And along with defining your purpose is defining specific questions that you can go out, measure, and get answers for. Monitoring programs need to consider the data and analyses that will help get them their answers. How precise and repeatable do your field sampling methods need to be? Different field methods can lead to huge differences in the cost of data collection. And one of the biggest factors, if you're interested in wildlife, is whether you monitor wildlife species directly, because studying animal species can be really expensive. Also, do you need a huge number of plots for significance testing, or do you need just a general sense of outcomes? And folks often tend to overlook the need to have some kind of reference for comparison. Things like cheatgrass or sage-grouse populations can vary tremendously from one year to the next. So it can be difficult to say that your treatment caused a year-to-year change unless you have control plots or before-after data, or better yet, both in a Backy style design. Although that being said, there's still quite a bit of room to tailor your design to your needs and your budget. What about the scale of your monitoring program? In addition to the size of your projects, another really important consideration is whether you want to have statistical inference for individual treatments versus your restoration program as a whole. If you want inference for each individual treatment, you'll need to do samples somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 plots per site. Also, do you want your sampling methods to be compatible with pooled data like BLM's AIM program or something similar? A lot of these factors will influence the number of plots that you're able to collect and the data that you're able to collect on those plots. The complexity of your treatments and the heterogeneity of the treated landscapes will also influence your monitoring design. You'll need to sample more plots in really heterogeneous landscapes where you've got large gradients in elevation, soil, or plant communities. And layering of treatments through adaptive management can make things even more complex and require additional plots to account for combinations of treatments or retreatments. And last, and the biggest consideration, that we already touched on, is your capacity in terms of funding for monitoring, analysis, and reporting, the number of staff you have available, and the time that they can commit to your monitoring program, as well as the timing of getting them out there in the field. Also, you have to consider the skill sets needed to collect your data. Do they need to be plant taxonomy experts, or can you get away with lumping plants into functional groups so that more field techs will be able to contribute to data collection? So there's a real trade-off between these key factors, and we're going to show an example of how one group navigated this balancing act with the hope of that it might help other resource managers who are thinking about their monitoring needs. The Oregon Rangeland Monitoring Program, with the funny sounding acronym ORMP, is a collective of agencies, private landowners, and nonprofits, all using standardized methods to monitor restoration projects in Eastern Oregon. And then it grew from there to include Indow in Nevada and Fish and Wildlife Refuge in Montana. So there's lots of interest in what these folks are doing. These groups implement a whole slew of restoration efforts on private and public lands, and they're aimed at improving sage-grouse habitat through herbicide, seedings, and juniper removal. ORMP started in 2022 when we at USGS helped the group design a monitoring approach that would balance the trade-offs that I just talked about, especially given that each group's capacity to undertake monitoring is really quite limited. Since the pilot year in 2022, ORMP crews have covered a lot of ground, monitoring restoration projects and kind of consistently increasing the number of plots sampled each year. As we developed ORMP, we held advisory group meetings to identify the group's purpose and audience, which helped them inform their monitoring questions. The partners decided that they needed monitoring information for decision and policymakers and to report outcomes to funders. But most importantly to them was knowing as soon as possible if their treatments needed follow-up adaptive management, whether their restoration approach should be used in the future, and where and why treatments tended to succeed or fail. The group drilled down a bit further to consider what measures and indicators would be the most useful for their goals. They came up with this three tiers of monitoring questions and indicators. Tier 1 is the most general, with the simplest response variables. These are related to like post-treatment ecosystem function, which could be quickly assessed using threat-based ecostates, which is a simple system for classifying ecological conditions of rangelands. They also looked at the ratio of invasive annual grasses to perennial grasses to understand trends and site resilience. Tier 2 monitoring questions and the indicators for them focused on evaluating treatment effects, which can vary depending on the type of treatment and its goals for habitat improvement. As an example, for herbicide treatments, they were interested in knowing if the target weed species was reduced and if they were able to release desired species for sage grouse like perennial grasses and native forbs. The third tier encompasses more specific questions that might be of interest to certain practitioners. So not every group within ORMP collects this information, but those who do can use those data to get at more mechanistic type questions or wildlife centered questions like sage grouse survival, recruitment, or use of restoration landscapes. Then they considered some of the concepts we talked about at the beginning for designing a monitoring program that matches their need for data and their needs for rigor. They wanted to collect pre and post treatment data. They wanted to monitor at control plots to account for year-to-year variability. They wanted to collect data annually and for the advertised longevity of any of the herbicides they applied. And they recognized that with adaptive management, treatments would often be layered one on top of another to address weed succession or needing to retreat seeded areas. things like that. So their plots would have to be efficiently sampled so that they could get a large enough sample size to account for those contingencies. Although they decided that having enough replicates for statistical significance testing wasn't high on their priority list, they did want inference for individual treatments so that, for example, an individual landowner could know if a treatment worked on their property, or NDOW could determine if newer approaches they were trying were resulting in better outcomes. And last, the ORMP group wanted to be able to pool data across the various group members in the group so that they could assess how much they were collectively moving the needle for sage grouse habitat across their Eastern Oregon landscape. The size of treatments being monitored under ORMP vary from under 5 acres to 18,000 acres, like the large green treatment on the left there. So really small up to quite large. Treatments also overlap, like we mentioned before, because of follow-up adaptive management projects. And sometimes only a portion of the original project area is retreated, like you see on the map on the right there. And beyond the size of treatments, they had to consider that the scope of this spans multiple counties in Eastern Oregon and other places in different states as well. So the USGS team helped identify characteristics like heat load, elevation, soils, pretreatment veg within each of those treatment areas so that plots could be stratified across those factors that are known to influence vegetation outcomes. In the treatment shown here, you see each color represents a different combination of elevation by heat load. Treatments like this one can be really variable in terms of abiotic conditions. So it's important to sample sites across these gradients if you want to know where your treatments tend to work. But in our 5-way seesaw, we saw that capacity is the most limiting consideration for designing these monitoring programs. And it's certainly the case for the ORMP members. And there's still a significant resource investment from our partners in terms of monitoring plots, from personnel, training, and travel. And all those resources are finite. So the USGS SAGE and FIRE funding has helped us balance the capacity factor for these folks in a few ways. The USGS team is addressing capacity by removing barriers for our resource managers in 3 main ways: collecting, sharing, and filtering and summarizing the data. In terms of collecting the data, after helping the ORMP group identify their design, we developed a GIS tool that can automate that stratification that I showed you earlier, stratifying and placing plots for treated and control areas. It's really quite useful, and it removes a potential barrier for our resource managers by taking that GIS work off of their plates. Streamlined data collection is a key so that folks can collect enough data across heterogeneous treated areas to have robust sample sizes and defensibility. So to streamline things, the monitoring crews visit sites and collect data using Survey 123 and field maps on phones or tablets. And the survey form is shared across the partner groups. And individual groups can opt in or out of certain sampling protocols depending on their needs. The ORMP crews use rapid ocular sampling techniques for key functional groups or species, and they assign threat-based ecostate categories at each plot. Most of the groups in ORMP also sample at least 1 plot per treatment using the standard line point intercept protocol so that they're able to correlate cover estimates with the LPI derived values, and they can use that to determine error rates, things like that. Because the streamlined data collection protocol is standardized and housed on a shared Survey 123 form, the monitoring data can be easily shared across groups within the partnership, and it can be combined into a database. But I think the most intriguing way that we're removing barriers to monitoring and information sharing is through the last element, that filtering and summarization. The USGS already hosts an online tool called the Land Treatment Exploration Tool. The LTET helps land managers with treatment planning by providing comprehensive information about their site, things like past treatments, wildfires, climate, soils, and other GIS-derived info. And we're working with the ORMP partnership to integrate their monitoring data into the LTET so that treatment effectiveness results can be served up as well. And the final way we're removing barriers to capacity is by displaying the monitoring results in two different dashboards. The first is this in-season dashboard to help track progress during field season. So folks can see which plots have been monitored and do some initial QC on the data. And then the second is a Tableau dashboard that helps summarize treatment effectiveness results for each of the three different tiers of indicator data that they've collected. This example shows tier 3 data on functional group cover through time in both treated and control plots. Down the road, we hope to get some responses by local sage-grouse populations that we can add into this, but that might still be a few years out for us. So those are some of the ways that the USGS team is helping remove these barriers to monitoring and information sharing for the ORMP partnership. If you're interested in learning more, please reach out to me, or if you're interested in participating in ORMP, please contact Jackie Couples. Also, stay tuned for a talk by Michelle Jeffries on how we're collaborating with the AIM program to evaluate all of our field sampling protocols to provide some guidance on which methods to consider using under different circumstances. That'll be a good talk from her. Thank you, and I'll take any questions if we have time.
Our next speaker is Michelle Jeffries, also from our Forest and Rangeland Ecosystem Science Center. And today, Michelle is going to be talking to us about Rome, which Robert mentioned here a little. Michelle, I can see your slides. I saw your face a second ago.
Okay, and hopefully you can hear me.
The floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Leif. So I'm a biologist with USGS Forest and Rangeland Ecosystem Science Center, and I just have a short update today about our Rome project. Just want to thank so much the USGS and the BLM for supporting this work, and it really builds off of a lot of what Robert was just discussing about monitoring needs and capacity. So let's see, there we go. So I'm going to start by setting the groundwork for how the Bureau of Land Management has handled standardized monitoring. They've done an exceptional job with a standardized monitoring approach called the Assessment, Inventory, and Monitoring Framework. I'm going to call that AIM for the rest of today. And essentially, they have implemented this standardized monitoring approach across the Western US on BLM lands. And all of these green dots are representing on-the-ground locations of very specific monitoring data that all follow a consistent protocol. And then on the graph on the left there, you can see the AIM program has really ramped up, in particular since about 2016. So they've got folks out there collecting thousands of on-the-ground monitoring plots every year. And these plots are really tailored to monitor the status and trend of BLM lands. So they can use these data to help support, allotment level decisions, field office level decisions, things like this. And at these plots, they collect very detailed, very standardized line point intercept based data collection. So it's very repeatable and has a very rigid, training component, very standardized. So I'm going to pose a situation here in the framework of using AIM. So here's a hypothetical fire with two hypothetical seeding treatments. And for this fire here in these two treatments, we have 4 AIM style plots, 3 in this blue seeding and 1 in this orange seeding, for a total of 4 for this fire. So do we think that 3 of these plots in one seeding and 1 in the other seeding is enough to determine treatment effectiveness? And depending on what your goals are, it might be. But if you're looking for things that try to capture the variability across this landscape and the variability across these treatments specifically, we might need to bolster this monitoring to include a larger sample size to represent a larger area of this fire. These AIM style plots are really great and really important, but they are quite time consuming because of the very detailed data that they collect. So they're, on that teeter-totter, there are some capacity restraints because of the detailed data collection. But what if we could collect an additional, I don't know, maybe 50 additional plots inside and outside these treatments to try to understand this, the effectiveness of these two different seedings inside and outside the fire. In this particular case, we don't have burned and untreated, but that could be a third, essentially, category here to benchmark your treatments against. And when we think about that teeter-totter, we're not going to be able to monitor an additional 50 AIM style plots because there's just no way, the capacity isn't there for that, and there won't ever be the capacity for that. So we have this project that we began a couple years ago called Rapid and Other Methods for Assessment and Monitoring. I will admit this acronym has changed over time, but we kept ROAM, so it is a mouthful. And essentially, we are identifying, testing, and verifying some rapid methods that provide information to help understand if a restoration event was successful and why. And we are conveying the importance of standardization, validation, repeatability, data management, and training. And we want to make sure that this complements the existing monitoring framework, in particular for the BLM AIM program. How could we provide some supplemental methods that can be repeatable and are standardized in addition to their existing framework? So essentially what we're doing is we are measuring everything. So our crews go to a single plot and we are looking at a whole suite of different methods. So there's approximately 15 methods, depending on how you define methods. And those are across all kinds of things, from downward facing photos, line point intercept. We're doing stick point intercept, which is similar to land PKS, step point intercept, or boot notch. That's been used for years. We're collecting vegetation height with these different methods. We're looking at canopy and basal gap. We're doing some different methods for density, including some different belt designs, and point quarter, which is some distance sampling, and also some classification estimates of threat-based ecostates that Robert mentioned as well. So our crews spend a lot of time at a single plot, way more time than we would ever expect for an actual project. But what we're doing is we're collecting all of this data at the same location across all of these methods, and that'll help us decide, can we use more rapid methods to adequately get an idea of what that landscape is like, so that we can add 50 plots worth of information to that last example without spending 10 more days in the field. Can we do that with just one more day of effort and collect 50 plots? In addition to all of this, our field crews are also surveyed on how they feel about these methods. So we've developed a very thorough survey that they've all taken, where they essentially rank all of these methods on how they feel these methods are efficient or representative or able to be used across different landscapes. So we have a very thorough survey that we're also collecting how it feels to be a field crew out there and collecting these methods and how they think it's representing the landscapes. So what we've been able to do so far is we've sampled a handful of plots. So this began in 2023. Those are in the yellow, and also in 2024. And you can see I've also added the Sagebrush Collaborative Restoration Landscapes on here, and we have sampled several plots in some of these landscapes. And I should have added on that last slide, many of these plots are also flown with drones. So we're also going to have some drone imagery to compare for these locations across all of these different methods. And then the last thing I wanted to show you is we do have a web page where you can learn a little bit more about the work. So this is our landing page where we outline a little bit about what we're doing. And one of the things is we have a diagram of what our plots look like across all of them, a little bit of information about the drone pilots, and then of course that same map that I just showed there. So that's all I wanted to share, a brief update about Project Rome, but we can pause here for questions.
Let's move on to the second round of 3 talks. Our next speaker is Adam Noel from our USGS Southwest Biological Science Center. And today, Adam's going to be talking to us about pinyon-juniper treatments for minimizing climate and fire vulnerability. So, Adam, I can see your face. I can see your slides.
Mic working all right?
Floor is yours, sir.
Awesome. Thank you, Leif. Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Adam Noel. I'm a postdoc working with John Bradford out of the SBSC in Flagstaff. Been working on this larger project with a whole host of co-authors, which you can see listed down here at the bottom. These co-authors are across the USGS, Northern Arizona University, the National Park Service, and also the Bureau of Land Management. And so this project, pinyon-juniper treatments for minimizing climate and fire vulnerability, was also funded by the Bureau of Land Management and also the Land Management Research Program. And this project is really a larger set of 4 kind of sub-projects. I'm not going to go through all of these, but just briefly thinking about each one of these, we kind of think about where might future climate change impact other woodland resources in the West. How might management treatments affect or ameliorate the impact of these climate-driven declines in PJ? And then thinking more specifically about what might optimal treatments be and where might we place those treatments in a case study in Southwest Colorado. So a lot going on with this larger umbrella project, but today I'm really just going to focus on this first sub-project, evaluating implications of changing climate suitability for high-value woodland resources in the U.S. West. And we're really close to submitting this manuscript to a journal. And then the overall kind of focus of this project is to help inform conservation design at a kind of landscape to regional scale. So this project is actually built off of one that we just recently completed. And in that project, we asked, how will future climate impact suitability for pinyon-juniper trees? We've already seen the effects of climate on PJ distribution and how they can kind of enable some pinyon-juniper shifts down into sagebrush ecosystems, kind of encroaching of PJ from the sides. We've seen climate kind of affect PJ systems in some mortality or dieback and regrowth, some demographic shifts in PJ, ranging all the way to just full mortality in vegetation composition shifts on the landscape. So we asked this question, how will future climate impact suitability for pinyon-juniper trees? Which is really the basis of this first project, thinking about modeling future climate suitability. We created species distribution models for 3 pinyon and 6 juniper trees listed there on the left. And for each one of these species, we estimated current suitability using a set of climate and soil variables. We used the same variables, but from future climate scenarios to then project future suitability and change in suitability to those future time periods. We have projections for 3 different emission scenarios, so low, moderate, and severe emission scenarios, the SSPs down there. And then also have these projections at 2 different time periods, so both mid-century and end-century. And then we assessed the agreement among suitability projections, assessing the change across many future projections to categorize that change as either robust to future climate change or not. And so this is all really this first initial project where we get suitability projections. This was just published in January in Rangeland Ecology and Management. Most pinyon-juniper woodland species distributions are projected to shrink rather than shift under climate change. And so that really lays the foundation for our first objective of this larger project that I was talking about, where we evaluate implications of that change in climate suitability for other woodland resources in the US West. Apologies. So now we're getting into the methods here, where we have this first set of suitability projecting models from this paper. We want to combine all of the projections from those individual species into one metric of community suitability for pinyon-juniper woodlands. Then when we have that metric of community suitability, we intersect it with additional data on burn probability and on locations of mature and old growth forest type. And we want to do some of these cross analyses to really key into how can we plan and prioritize management efforts in pinyon-juniper or in western landscapes. And at the kind of end goal of this project is to create an example framework for climate adaptation planning to consider some of those management options. So moving into results, crossing these measures of community suitability and other data can help answer some management questions. For example, here we are asking, where can pinyon-juniper be managed to promote high suitability pinyon-juniper woodlands in the future and also meet fuel reduction goals? And so this is a bivariate analysis where we've placed community suitability on the x-axis, varying from low community, moderate, and medium community suitability, and burn probability on the y-axis. And when we cross these two, we can see how the landscape is sort of categorized by these pixel values of both these two variables. And you could consider how management options might change based on the condition of PJ woodlands. So for example, locations in this green color are areas of high future community suitability and also high burn probability. So management options in these areas might focus on fuel reduction and maintaining current pinyon-juniper species composition, if that is your desired goal on the landscape. So it could be in contrast to these areas in yellow, where they're also high burn probability, but they are a lower future community suitability estimated for those areas. So we still might want to do fuel reduction treatments there, and then really just monitor the PJ trend, maybe not put so many resources into maintaining that PJ where it's not suitable in the future. And then last, I want to point out this blue color, areas that have high future community suitability and low burn probability, maybe areas that we don't really need to allocate management resources towards. PJ should do well there in the future, and it's unlikely to burn, or at least less likely than other places. So maybe we could reallocate those management resources elsewhere. And so this is one example of a bivariate analysis that we conducted in this project. We looked at two more different bivariate analyses, these second two questions, where we ask, where does community suitability in pinyon-juniper mature and old growth forest type overlap to indicate vulnerable or high value refugia for woodlands? And so these two categories, vulnerable or high value, we could think of areas with high future community suitability and a lot of MOG as high value potential refuge for a PJ in the future. And you can see a lot of these dark polygons in southern Utah, northern Arizona, New Mexico, and across the Great Basin. And that could kind of contrast with areas of low future suitability and also still high MOG. So high value, mature and old growth forest resources that may be a little bit more vulnerable in the future. And our last bivariate analysis was asking, where can current pinyon-juniper communities fully realize potential future suitability? And this was a cross of our metric of community suitability with a metric we're calling HCFS, which stands for historic contribution to future suitability. And this is kind of just a measure of, can estimated suitability be fully realized by those species, or would other species that are not currently there have to be introduced naturally or with management assistance to fully realize that site's potential? Happy to talk about that afterwards. Don't really have time to get into it today. So these are three examples of bivariate analyses where we're trying to inform climate adaptation efforts for the future. And then as a last step, we want to take all these different sets of data and combine them into one example framework that might inform climate adaptation planning. So again, looking at the landscape, looking at the pinyon-juniper communities, and parsing it out into areas that may have high or medium future suitability versus areas with low suitability. Within those distinct categories, is it high or low burn probability? And then again, another split, is there pinyon-juniper mature old growth resources, or is there not? And so when you get down to these final categories, you can kind of key into some important ones. Areas in this green color good suitability in the future, low burn probability, and mature old growth resources. Those locations might be promising to try and conserve pinyon-juniper woodlands there on the landscape. And that might be in contrast to these other categories, for example, in the blue color, which also has high future suitability, but then has high burn probability. So you may want to take management actions that reduce burn probability there if your goal is to keep PJ on the landscape. And of course, this is an example framework, so we really want to emphasize that this is just a template that we would love to include other management priorities in. There's so much going on in the Western landscapes that it'd be great to try and combine all this information into one overall look. So we could also include other landscape objectives like sagebrush conservation priorities. How do they align with future pinyon-juniper suitability? Could also think about pinyon jay habitat or other areas of really high importance for grazing or wildlife habitat. Still working through how we might include this data perhaps in a next step. And so that's kind of the current state of this step one of the larger umbrella project, thinking about future community suitability and how does it impact other woodland resources on the landscape. We're really close to submitting this, hoping to submit it in the next month and then have that data release, immediately following in a GeoTIFF format that'll be available on Sciencebase. And then as of right now, if you are interested in the individual species suitability projections, those are already up on Sciencebase at this link down here. And you can find more information on those suitability projections in this paper in rangeland ecology and management. And then also, if you just want to view and see how those projections change across time scenarios, you could view this Google Earth Engine app, which is kind of neat just to see how things change across the landscape using different sliders. So thank you for your time. I think that I'll take questions if there is any time.
Our last speaker of today's session is Sarah Halperin from the USGS Forest and Rangeland Ecosystem Science Center. And today we're going to be hearing a little bit more about synthesizing these ecological impacts. There's the title right there, synthesizing these ecological impacts of disturbance on wildlife in pinyon-juniper woodlands. So Sarah, I can see your slides.
All right. Can you hear me all right too?
I can hear you. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Leaf, and thank you, Adam and Andreas, for the awesome introduction to what I'll be talking about today. I'll be presenting on some work that I did as a postdoctoral fellow with Doug Shinneman. And a quick thanks to our team here at USGS and to the BLM for providing feedback, a manager's perspective, as well as funding this work. So natural disturbance such as wildfire, drought, and insect outbreak can in many cases be a dominant driver of community structure and ecosystem function. As such, natural disturbances can affect wildlife, as I'm sure many of you know. And while disturbance dynamics may result in negative impacts on some wildlife species, responses to disturbance are often complex and not necessarily detrimental. So in this figure here, from a paper released in 2022, we can see how the effect of disturbance can really greatly vary. And in pinyon-juniper woodlands, disturbance dynamics are likely leading to both infill, so within existing woodlands, as well as expanding into adjacent ecosystems, while also reductions, which we just heard about, across their range. So they're expanding into adjacent shrublands and grasslands in some regions, while also declining in areas due to drought as well as wildfire-driven transformations. So these divergent trajectories of pinyon-juniper woodlands make their long-term management challenging and really underscore the importance of evaluating what we know about pinyon-juniper woodlands. And much of that literature has been summarized in an article published in 2020 by Hartzell et al. And this really talked about the general state of knowledge and characterized disturbance within pinyon-juniper woodlands. There's additional syntheses that looked at more ecological responses, but those have largely focused on impacts of tree removal, including one of those syntheses is one that was conducted within our lab, and that was on the impacts of treatment on vegetation and wildlife responses. This is an existing open file report with literature up until March 2021. And we are currently working on updating that with more current literature and plan to publish that in a scientific journal. So I will, at the end of this, will put a link to that report. However, there's still remaining gaps within the literature, particularly relating to the impacts of disturbance on wildlife. So we conducted a systematic review to provide an overview of the known impacts of natural disturbance on pinyon-juniper associated wildlife. Our specific objectives were to first identify and catalog the extent of information that's out there. We then used a narrative approach to synthesize what those papers were saying and what those effects are on wildlife. And we used that information to identify knowledge gaps and research priorities. Then quickly to go over some methods, we focused on responses of wildlife or wildlife habitat to disturbance, irrespective of taxonomic group. So any taxonomic group or species was included. We focused on the effects of 3 major disturbances: drought, wildfire, and insect outbreak. We intended to also include climate change impacts. However, given limitations in the literature explicitly examining climate change impacts on wildlife, independent from other disturbances like drought, for instance, we did not include it in this analysis. We restricted the review to the geographic range of 6 pinyon and juniper species. So anywhere that those species are present, even if in low densities. And we included all literature published on or before June 24th, 2024. Moving on to results. So following the screening of articles pulled from Web of Science, we found 29 journal articles that fit that criteria. And you can see the locations of those papers on the left. And then on the right, I highlight a few key aspects of the literature. First, we found that most articles were observational studies utilizing collected field data. There was a limited number of insect outbreak papers, and both of those also fell within the drought category. Birds were the most frequently represented taxonomic group with 16 articles. And then when we take a look at the type of response, most were other demographics, so relating to density, survival, population growth rate, for example, as well as habitat responses, so habitat use or selection. And there was a limited number of reproductive responses. If we take a further look at what habitat association, those species that were studied are related to, that was more evenly spread. But most articles were within 2-needle pinyon as the dominant or co-dominant vegetation. And now focusing more on the synthesis aspect of the review, following drought, we found both positive and negative responses, especially for bird species. But responses were both species specific and habitat specific. So for example, spotted towhees were found to be sensitive to drought when in pinyon-juniper ecosystems, whereas other species such as the house finch or gray viero showed a positive response. Interestingly, however, when we looked at the spotted towhees as within more sagebrush ecosystems, the paper reported a positive response. So when they're breeding in sagebrush habitats. When looking at the effects of wildfire, we also found both positive and negative responses, this more across taxonomic groups. An example of a negative response might be pinyon-juniper obligate and semi-obligate species being generally absent from burned areas, and several articles found negative impacts to sage grouse. Other papers showed wildfire to benefit some wildlife species. For example, one paper found a positive short-term response for certain bird species, such as the lark sparrow and hairy woodpecker, likely due to shifts in habitat heterogeneity and structure, as well as increased food availability. We only identified 2 articles related to insect outbreak, and both of those found negative responses. It's important to note that while these papers showed a negative response, we know from other forested ecosystems that responses to insect outbreak can really vary and often in times can lead to increased food availability for many bird species, particularly bark drilling species. So overall, our results indicate variable wildlife responses to disturbance and really highlight the uncertainty and complexity in predicting impacts. We also noted that across the papers included in our review, that responses were primarily inferred based on factors like species abundance and lacked exploration of, say, the mechanisms driving that response. So in this conceptual diagram here, we illustrate the benefits of using a more mechanistic framework to understand the impacts of disturbance on wildlife. So taking a look at the diagram, this depicts a hypothetical pinyon-juniper dominated landscape undergoing a series of disturbances. Each of those disturbances can interact with each other as well as climate change, and that may lead to changes in wildlife species composition, which is represented by the pie chart. And then on the right, we use songbirds as an example to illustrate that due to a lack of a mechanistic framework, it's unclear whether songbird responses were due to changes in, say, food resources or predation pressure or nesting sites, or maybe an unexamined factor. So what does this mean? While current management is often focused on tree removal, our work suggests that it's additionally important to consider management interactions with disturbance and to anticipate and mitigate dieback. So exactly what Adam and Andreas were talking about. So that was an excellent introduction. There isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. Instead, our review shows that given the variability in wildlife responses, it'll be important to consider disturbance and incorporate existing knowledge, such as many existing management resources that can aid in understanding potential successful management pathways. This is just one example by Redmond et al., published in 2023. And some of their suggestions include preserving juvenile trees, keeping snags and logs, as well as shrubs to promote tree establishment and survival, especially under drought conditions. And this can provide habitat for ground-dwelling arthropods, for example, and some avian species. So in summary, our review highlights that while it seems like we should know a lot about disturbance impacts on wildlife in pinyon-juniper ecosystems, there remains key knowledge gaps. We see substantial knowledge gaps in some disturbance types, particularly insect outbreak and climate change, across taxonomic groups, particularly non-avian groups, and across pinyon-juniper communities, types, and ecoregions. Our narrative synthesis really underscored that complexity and variability in wildlife responses. So ultimately, we suggest focusing on major gaps in literature, as well as the mechanisms, pathways, and cause and effect relationships driving wildlife responses. This work is wrapping up in the next couple of months, and this week we submitted the article for publication, so hopefully that will be out in a few months. In the meantime, you can visit our project webpage or take a look at that previous report that I mentioned earlier, which is a synthesis of the ecological effects of pinyon-juniper removal. And as a reminder, we are currently working on updating that work. And with that, thank you, and happy to take questions.